First of all, welcome. This is the first in-person event of the 22-23 academic year. Can't remember the last time I've seen this room this full. I'd like to think that has everything to do with our speaker and nothing to do with the free food. But, we're all graduate students once, and, that's something that never goes away. So in any case, it's really nice to see everybody here, and thank you very, very much for coming. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Murtha. I'm the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of Chinese Politics here at SAIS. I'd like to thank all the people who made this event possible, Pedro Matias, Elena Sardillo, Destiny Curtis, and of Lexi Jaramillo, and of course Beth Wooten, without whom none of this would be happening. We'll begin today's program with Professor Shih giving a talk, followed by a short moderated discussion between him and me. Then we'll open up the floor for questions. But before all of that, let me introduce our guest. So, Victor Shih is the Ho-Mio Lam Chair in China and Pacific Relations and Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego, at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. He's the author of Factions and Finance in China, Elite Conflict and Inflation, which came out in 2008 from Cambridge. It is the first book to explore the linkages between elite politics and banking policies in China. His second book, Economic Shocks and Authoritarian Stability, will be published by the University of Michigan Press. Is that outdated?
Yeah, it's outdated.
Okay. Has been published by the University of Michigan Press. He's the author of numerous other articles appearing in academic and business journals, including the APSR, the American Political Science Review for you civilians, China Quarterly, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Politics, Wall Street Journal, China Business Review. And he's a frequent advisor to the financial community. Dr. Shih holds a BA from George Washington University right here in town and a doctorate in government from Harvard. He was also a former principal at the Carlyle Group and the Global Market Group. His current research looks at coalition composition under Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, and specifically the research looks into whether Mao and Deng strategically promoted certain types of officials into senior positions in the military and in the party in order to safeguard their power. That, of course, has resulted in this absolutely terrific monograph that we'll be talking about today. And let me just speak to that. Coalitions of the Week is a momentous achievement. It is a recasting of people and events that upends the conventional wisdom along multiple dimensions. It is a fascinating study of the military in Chinese politics, in this case, the Fourth Front Army, in a completely upending narrative. And it is an extraordinary contextualizing of the rise of Xi Jinping with roots extending deep into the Mao era. It is, in short, a tour de force. Victor is also a friend with whom I've shared many beers over the years, and I'm delighted to welcome him back to SAIS. Victor, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Andy, for these kind words, and thank you for having me here. To give you some background on how I'm speaking today, I literally just emailed Andy like 3 weeks ago and be like, hey, I'll be in town. Can I give a talk? And he very generously immediately said yes. So thank you very much for doing that. It's a great pleasure to speak here today about my new book. So what I'm going to do today is to give you the basic theoretical framework of the book, followed by the application of the theory to politics in the 1980s. So 1980s was a time, of course, most of you will know, these immortals, people from the revolutionary generation, governed in a coalition over China And then that resulted in a certain pattern of promotion for even younger cohorts of officials, which of course affected politics of China today with the domination of Xi Jinping in politics. So I'm going to tell you the story of politics in the 1980s and how that affected politics today. Okay, so let me begin. Is this the control I would use for? Oh, it's that one. Sorry. Oh yeah, here we go. So here's the cover of the book again. So you note that in the cover of the book, this was close to the perfect picture, but not really the one that I would have chosen. There was another one also with Jiang Qing in it, which is the one that I would prefer. But that apparently the copyright for that was extremely murky, and Cambridge just didn't want to touch. This was like a Getty's image, and they're like, just use this one, whatever. It's like you just want a bunch of old Chinese guys, in the front. I'm like, I want a woman, like I want Jiang Qing, and that one. Well, okay, don't get me started on Jiang Qing. I personally think she's one of the greatest Chinese leaders, in the 20th century. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, so basically, the reason why this is my second choice, but still very strong choice, is because you have three of the main actors in my book on the cover. You have Ye Jianying, who's sitting to the right of Hua Guofeng, or to the left of Hua Guofeng, I guess, from his perspective. You also have Li Xiannian, who's next to Ye Jianying. Those two hated each other, but they ended up governing in a coalition for over a decade, interestingly. And then Deng Xiaoping, of course, being the Deng Xiaoping pivotal actor. To get a sense of the importance of Deng Xiaoping to the politics of the 1970s and 1980s, I will give a talk on that at GW on Wednesday. So if people really, or you can get the book and read all about it. Also, okay. But today, I am instead going to talk about these people. So these are some of the most connected, politically savvy princelings. So princelings, as most of you know, children of revolutionary generation senior leaders, including senior PLA generals. These in the 1980s, they were the most promising officials. So Chen Yuan rose up extremely rapidly through the bureaucracy in the Beijing municipal government, rising up to vice mayor. He aspired to be the mayor of Beijing, which would have, like Jiang Zemin, put him one step away from a Politburo seat and potentially higher offices in the future. Liu Yuan, who's sitting in the sort of the far right, looking out, likewise was a 副市长, vice governor, vice mayor in a major city. But for those two and for other princelings, their careers were stymied in the late 1980s by some of the same revolutionaries who were parents of a lot of these princelings. They did not help, by and large, they did not help so much the children of other revolutionary veterans, leading to active discrimination, I would argue, of the princelings, especially when they rose to the vice ministerial and full ministerial level. The story that I'm going to tell is that as a result, only relatively few. So, if you ask Li Cheng, it's like, oh my God, Victor, you're ridiculous. There are all these princelings in Chinese politics. That's true. Obviously, he's never said that to me, of course. He's a very nice guy. He would never say that. But if he were speaking like me, that's what he would say, because I'm not a nice guy. No, I'm just joking. So basically, there are a lot of princelings in politics, but a lot of the princelings that we know about, they're not in politics. They're in the commercial world, right? Like Bo Xicheng eventually ended up in the commercial world. Chen Yuan ended up as president of China Development Bank. Liu Yuan did better, but only because he went over to the PLA, where after he went to the PLA, senior civilian positions were completely off the table for him. So he didn't get a chance to rise to at the very high level at the Politburo Standing Committee levels. So all their careers were stymied, except for the 2 or 3 princelings who were smart enough to leave Beijing and go down to the grassroots to become local officials in Hebei province first, and then Fujian, and then Zhejiang. Of course, we know who that is. But, also others. Bo Xilai did the same thing, left Beijing, went to Liaoning province, and eventually, I would say fairly successfully. I mean, basically the objective of all these princelings was to get into the Politburo. That's you become Gaoceng, you become a high-level cadre, and this is really what you wanted. But as I'll show you some numbers, very few of them actually made it to that level. And I would argue it was due to a deliberate strategy of senior leaders, senior revolutionary veterans of the 1980s who actively discriminated against the princelings and actively favored Lao Hao Ren, right? So these officials who were always nice people, who were technocratic, but politically with very thin networks, and I'll show you some numbers demonstrating that, who would never challenge the authorities of the revolutionary veterans. The problems with the princeling is that they had very dense networks and they could challenge the veterans even as they serve as mid-level officials. And the veterans didn't want that. And that's why they were discriminated against. Okay. Why is this an underlying logic in authoritarian politics? So to go back, I'll take a step back. Theoretically, as some of you who are, I would say drowning or bathing in this comparative politics literature on authoritarian regimes, which is very fun literature, but in recent years, there's this big tendency to say that, obviously authoritarian politics in some countries is very stable because they have institutions. They have one-party regimes, and the one party, ensures that the elites are, there's transparency and distribution of payoff to the elites, and therefore, the regime is more stable. And that's true, but if you look at some single-party revolutionary regimes, like the Soviet Union and China, not everything was going so hunky-dory in some of these places. Stalin basically massacred all the fellow revolutionaries who won the revolution along with him. They were all killed by Stalin, basically. In China, obviously not nearly as bad. They were not killed, but then, we had over half of the Politburo and the Central Committee being purged in the lead up to the Cultural Revolution, and of course during the Cultural Revolution itself, including ultimately the close comrade of Chairman Mao, Lin Biao. He was purged, along with a bunch of generals who were very close to Lin Biao, very close to Chairman Mao. They were purged. These are not exactly stable outcomes in one-party dictatorships. And of course, Soviet Union collapsed after a failed coup ultimately. And then around the time of 2012, there were all these rumors of an attempted coup launched by Zhou Yongkang, against Hu Jintao or Xi Jinping. I couldn't really clarify which is which. So there are all of these issues in one-party dictatorships, despite there are these cross-national statistical findings, that shows that one-party dictatorships, they last longer, they're more stable. It doesn't mean that they are problem-free. And the other outcome that's really interesting is that China, of course, as most of you know, they have a very complex cadre evaluation system that score cadres on the basis of education, their accomplishments, et cetera, et cetera. I think David Bowman here is an expert in that at the local level. But of course, you routinely see a lot of mediocre, corrupt, highly inexperienced cadres rising to the top, right? Both at the local, so at the local level, of course, you see these, very, Yemen, very barbaric kind of officials, beating up people and so on and so forth. But even at the central level, they're not, barbaric by any means, but they have very thin CVs, right? So, and the prime example for me today is Wang Huning. So Wang Huning never governed over anything, really, except for a think tank. Never was a minister of state council, never was party secretary or governor of a province. Nonetheless, suddenly he gets in the Politburo Standing Committee. Right? So what's the deal with that? Well, in fact, during the late Mao period especially, you did see quite a few people like that. You had Chen Yonggui, who was this farmer, semi-literate farmer who became vice premier in charge of agriculture. Wu Guixian, who's a textile worker in charge of industry. Wang Hongwen, a worker one day, vice chairman of the Chinese Communist Party the next day. Why did we see these kinds of outcomes? I argue that there's an inherent incentive in authoritarian regimes to favor thinly networked, inexperienced, and politically compromised and corrupt officials. So there's actually this underlying mechanism to systematically promote officials with these characteristics higher up. It doesn't mean that they're going to be at the very top, but in filling the senior ranks, very likely. And the reason is because dictators all face a very uncertain environment in that they typically don't know who their enemies are. Everyone belongs to the same party, the Chinese Communist Party. You don't really know who your enemies are. Even if you suspect who your enemies are, you don't really know how powerful they are relative to you. Traditionally, of course, and I've written a lot of work on this, the response to that is to pursue factionalism, right? So you promote people who has had a history of working closely with you, who has done loyal services to you. You promote those people, and of course, we do statistically. There's very robust finding. Leaders do pursue that, including Xi Jinping. There's all the Zhejiang officials getting promoted to the senior level, Fujian officials, promoting to the senior levels. But I would say that there's a limit to that, because the problem with that, of course, is you run into people like Lin Biao, right? So Lin Biao is supposedly very loyal to Mao, but ultimately, if someone like Lin Biao were to get powerful enough, you ultimately cannot trust whether or not they're going to overthrow the incumbent. So then another strategy is to replace powerful figures, or who you suspect to be powerful figures, with people that definitely are weak. And that will improve the dictator's odds of staying in power during political struggles. And I'll tell you what I mean by weak figures shortly. Why? The replacement of powerful veterans with weak officials will increase the dictator's relative power and lessen the probability of a rival coalition sufficiently powerful to overthrow the incumbent. In an information-poor environment, the best way to prevent a coup is to know that the rest of the elite is too weak to challenge your power. Right? So at the end of the day, it's like, even if someone's like, oh, I'm very loyal to you, oh, we have a deep history together, you can trust me, I'm not going to overthrow you. You can't believe that. Because if they're powerful enough, who knows? Maybe they will. So the best guarantee is you pick the people that they don't even have the capacity to challenge your power, because either they're so inexperienced, they don't know what the heck is going on, they clearly lack any kind of network in the party, in the military, to challenge your power, or that they've done something so bad in the past that no one would make an alliance with this person because they've done something so bad and so wrong in the past. And this is really the main story that I tell in the book, is this latter story. I mean, I do talk about the inexperienced officials also, but also the Fourth Front Army, which include people like Li Xiannian, they split the party. That's as bad as you can get. They literally split the Chinese Communist Party. You could not commit a greater crime in the Chinese Communist Party than to literally split it apart. They did that, and Mao made use of them during the Cultural Revolution and later in his life. So that's the underlying logic laid out in the book. And of course, the strategy is only feasible if there are no major challenges to the regime externally. So Mao, of course, pursued this very actively after the Sino-US rapprochement. I mean, I think it's somewhat coincidental, but maybe not. Basically, Lin Biao began to really get in trouble after Kissinger's visit. and he was purged, in the middle of this rapprochement process. Some would say it's, Mao had to get rid of Lin Biao because he was too hostile to the U.S. So the causation of that, I'm not going to outline here, but certainly it made his pursuit of coalition of the weak and late in his life a lot more possible. The fact that his relationship with the U.S. was repaired at that time. Yes, and of course, when you pursue that, the regime is not going to do very well in terms of policymaking. The quality of policymaking also will decline. So that may or may not have some, lessons for what's happening in China today. I'll talk very briefly at the end. Okay, so what do I mean by weak officials? Inexperienced officials, junior officials with small, non-existing national level networks, and also they don't know how the elite political games are played. And so they're ignorant of the dictator's power in information set or information channels, as well as the alignment of factions at the top. Junior officials are more likely to follow the dictator's order to the letter instead of trying to manipulate anything that the dictator says. Because of lack of administrative experience, junior officials have small and non-existing factions, at least in the short term. This also prevents them from launching a challenge against the dictator. Yeah, so, and because their CVs are pretty publicly observable, the dictator know that these officials indeed are very weak because they're so junior, right? The other kind of weak officials with checkered history. And basically, these are actors whose rehabilitation within a given set of institutions would require considerable audience costs, right? So, splitting the party is a very bad thing. And to make it not a bad thing, you would have to go through this very long process of rehabilitation. Doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it would be time consuming and would be quite costly. Yes, I'll skip over some of this. Yeah, so short of overthrowing the ruling institutions entirely, the entire regime would have to rally around the incumbent if tainted elites were to plot a coup against the dictator. And even if a rival coalition had emerged, it would not have wanted to ally itself with the tainted faction due to additional costs. And then finally, actually, the more I think about it, the more I think this last logic is the strongest. Even though in the book I kind of threw in a bunch of different reasons for this. But basically, think about it, like if you're tainted in a given set of institutions, you know that even if you join some new right coalition to try to overthrow the incumbent, that new rival coalition were to win, you're still not going to be number one or even number two in the regime. So your expected payoff is lower. You're going to be number 3, number 4, number 5, like Li Xiannian was. And so it's like, why bother? These people already were number 5, number 6 in the regime. If they overthrew Mao or overthrew Deng Xiaoping, they still would be number 5, number 6. So why take the risk? Okay. All right. So here you do see that the number of ties with the rest of the elite of the average Politburo member from the 8th Party Congress to the 10th Party Congress, it declined. Of course, you could say, well, age would have done the same thing, but actually no, because in the 12th Party Congress, of course, these old guys came back and actually this shot up again. But certainly through the late Mao Congresses of the 9th Party Congress and 10th Party Congress, a lot of the densely networked elites were eradicated, replaced by sparsely networked elites at the Politburo level. You can see one standard deviation below the mean. Some of these officials, they barely had any connections with Central Committee members, 1 or 2 connections. Right? So that's what that lighter pink line at the bottom shows. And this is to give you a sense of like what policymaking was like in the late Mao period. Basically, the number of formal meetings, like party meetings, state council meetings, and of course, NPC-type meetings, fell to 0 for some of the years. And no meetings. Policymaking was just like Mao's nephew going to Chairman Mao and say, Deng Xiaoping said this, and Mao basically saying, like, and then Mao's nephew is like, 我听懂, like, I understand what you're saying. And he goes back to the Politburo and say, Mao just said this, and then everyone like believed it, so that's why Mao's nephew was very powerful for a time. It just became very ad hoc. The quality of decision was not the highest. But I do have to say, for Mao, he was very sharp right up to the very end. And I would say his decision to purge Deng Xiaoping toward the end of his life was the correct one. Deng Xiaoping was trying to challenge his power. So from a power, of course, Deng Xiaoping is a great guy, he never should have done it, of course. But I mean, from his own political perspective, Mao did the right thing. Deng Xiaoping was trying to challenge his power. And in the book, I outlined the many different ways in which Deng Xiaoping was trying to challenge Mao's power even before Mao had died. That's what made him such a gutsy sort of politician. Okay. So Mao's power strategy set the stage for I would call this the decentralized model of coalition of the weak politics in the 1980s and the 1990s. So basically, Mao's coalitions of the weak strategy left China with a group of experienced but roughly equally powerful leaders, especially after the mass rehabilitation of purged veterans that Deng instituted. Deng was the one who pushed for the mass rehabilitation of veterans. The backstory of that was because Mao used the Fourth Front Army, Xu Xiangqian, Xu Shiyou, Xu Xiangqian, to balance against Lin Biao. But then after Lin Biao fell from power, the entire PLA was dominated by the Fourth Front Army. And Deng Xiaoping was the only person who could divide the loyalty of the Fourth Front Army because he commanded a lot of the Fourth Front Army people during the anti-Japanese war and during the Chinese Civil War. But then even Deng Xiaoping himself, after he was rehabilitated, he didn't want to be 100% dependent on the Fourth Front Army. So then he had to rehabilitate all these other people who were purged by Mao from the First Front Army, from the Beifangju, from the Northern Bureau. So this is why, these people like Bo Yibo came back, and Peng Zhen, they came back to power, was because Deng Xiaoping needed a balance against the Fourth Front Army. So then you had these bunch of people who were roughly powerful as to each other. Chen Yun, all the immortals that we know included Deng Xiaoping, Chen Yun, Bo Yibo, Li Xiannian. And on the military side, Xu Xiangqian held very important PLA positions. And then you had other Fourth Front Army veterans like Qin Jiwei actually was in the Fourth Front Army, interestingly, Ministry of Defense through the 1980s. And they were all the rehabilitated veterans were put in charge of different parts of the government. Some were put in charge in some units in the PLA. Others, went back to lording over parts of the state councils. What happened with Bo Yibo? So Bo Yibo was very interventionist in economic policies until Deng Xiaoping's like, okay, fine, you can be in charge of the Central Advisory Commission or Committee. Chen Yun was in charge of the state council. So all these veterans, they were in charge of something. And for them, so then in the 80s, finally they were getting old. So in the sort of 60s, 70s, Hai Nianqing, still young and 没事, and there was this great speech that Chen Yun gave in the early 80s. He's like, 你的面润红红，你以为自己很健康，事实并不是这样, right? So it's like, your face, shows some color. You think you're young. You're not young. You're old, think about retirement. And it's like me, No, I'm just joking. Hopefully not 还可以, right? Like 还行, 希望, right? Hopefully. So then they would generally think about retirement. The next generation, they were forced by Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun to think about that. And on the one hand, they can promote Princelings. So Princeling children of their colleagues who are revolutionary veterans with a lot of networks, a lot of political insights, but and also very smart, receiving the best education in China. Because all these princelings, they went to Tsinghua University, Renmin University, Peking University, the best universities of China. They were the most educated in many cases. So why shouldn't it be them? Why shouldn't they fill the ranks of all the ministries and the provinces, et cetera, et cetera? But instead, what the rehabilitated veterans went for were by and large young, politically inexperienced technocrats. Basically, additionally, they discriminated against the princelings, especially those with a checkered history during the Cultural Revolution, right? So there was this thing called Xijiu, right? So the Western Picket Red Guard that was active at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. They defended a lot of officials in Beijing. So they tried to prevent the more radical Red Guards from ransacking certain ministries. But at the same time, they did go around beating up the teachers at Beijing Sizhong and Beijing No. 4 High School, Renda Fuzhong and all these places. It was like, wow, you beat up teachers. What's the big deal? It's like you just come up on stage, beat up. He can defend himself, so I wouldn't try, But these Red Guards, they did. They just beat up teachers and principals and so on and so forth. So after the Cultural Revolution, some of them got in trouble. But Chen Yun actually, whose son is Chen Yuan, forcefully pushed through a central document to say that if you are in this loyalist Red Guard, the Xijiu, and if your crimes were not so heinous, i.e. if you didn't beat anyone to death, then it's okay. Let bygone be bygone. So officially, these princelings should have been exonerated, but in reality, there was a lot of elite pushback against this, and a lot of princelings just could not get past the vice ministerial level and were stuck. And many of those who were stuck, they decided to go into the commercial world. It's like, well, if I can't have authorities, and I'll just get rich, right? So that's how a lot of these people went to the CITIC Group, Everbright Group, started their own business in Hong Kong, et cetera, became fabulously rich. And in the meantime, but what ended up happening was, because the vast majority of princelings washed out, so to speak, in the late 1980s, early 90s, the few princelings who were left in politics, which included Yu Zhengsheng, Liu Yandong, and of course Xi Jinping, and Bo Xilai, of course, had less competition, which I would argue ultimately was not the reason why Xi Jinping became so dominant within the Chinese Communist Party, but at least was a precondition for why he became so dominant so fast in the Chinese Communist Party soon after he took power. Okay, so that's a nice argument. So I'll show you some numbers to try to back it up. So there's a whole chapter. So if you look at just the kind of the data, just the children of Eighth Party Congress, which was 1956, Central Committee members, they had 290 children, which is quite a few, And the reason is I don't know if it's funny or historically this is what happened. At the end of the Long March, there were no women left in the party. The women were not allowed to go on the Long March by and large, except for the spouses of the top 10 officials in the party. So then you had a bunch of single men with no spouses. And then when the anti-Japan university started, all these urban intellectuals flooded into Yan'an. All the single men got married to women who were 20 years younger than them. And so they began to have a lot of babies. And so there was this huge baby boom in the Chinese political elite between sort of 1940 to 1955, 1960, including, Xi Jinping, of course, was born during this baby boom years. And so they had a lot of children, 290 children. Ultimately, only 11 of them achieved ministerial level rank. I would say that's a very low ratio, because they were all groomed to be high-level officials. They were all told when they were little, they were put in the best schools in China, Tsinghua Fuzhong, Beida Fuzhong, Beijing Sizhong, et cetera, or what's the one that Xi Jinping went to? The 八一学校, yeah, exactly. So all the best high schools, they got into very good universities. There should have been many more of them, but there were not. And even if and somebody's like, oh, it's because their parents lost power during the Cultural Revolution. So even if you look at the survivors of the Cultural Revolution, those who came back as 12th Party Congress Central Committee members, they had 64 children. Even among those people, only 5 made it to ministerial rank, which is, the ratio is higher, but 7.8%. You would think that ratio would be even higher, like 20% or something like that. So although Princelings were cultivated heavily in the 50s and 60s and the early 1980s, they faced barriers from the veterans. So there's this whole Red Guard problem. So some very ambitious Princelings like Kongdan and Bo Xicheng, they lost out because of this, because they were too active in the Red Guards. They went into business. So they went into business. So that sucked up a lot of people like Deng Pufang, Wang Jun, Ye Xunji, Qin Xiao, Chen Xiaolu, and Yu Zhengsheng. The only person to come back to politics successfully was Yu Zhengsheng, of course. Right. So Yu Zhengsheng eventually became Politburo Standing Committee member at the 18th Party Congress. Both veterans and newly promoted technocrats resisted promoting Princelings to vice ministerial or ministerial level positions because the Princelings were too powerful. They meddled, right? So if they became a mid-level officials in whatever ministry or whatever province, they would start meddling with high-level politics. And a lot of people just didn't want that. So they resisted Princelings. There was a funny story, actually. This guy, Yan Huai, wrote a really interesting book. He worked in the Central Organization Department, and Jiang Zemin was Minister of Electronics at the time, and Chen Yuan, this is the son of Chen Yun, wanted to be vice minister at the Electronics Ministry. And Jiang Zemin, who was in Chen Yun's faction, right? So Chen Yun has helped his career all along, told the author of the book, Yan Huai, is like, do I have to promote, Chen Yuan? Like, I really don't want to, because I know that once he becomes vice minister, my position is going to be hollowed out, because of course he's going to start meddling. I'm not going to have any authority. It's like, what excuse can I find to not appoint him? So Jiang Zemin came up with all these excuses. He's like, this out of my hands, 中组部有什么要求, had demands for this and that, and he didn't quite fit the criteria and all this kind of stuff. So he thought of all these different ways to prevent Chen Yuan from being appointed as a vice minister in the Ministry of Electronics. So a lot of stuff like that. And in the case of, once again, Chen Yuan, he also wanted to be the mayor of Beijing, and the whole Beijing Standing Committee just totally rejected it. They just voted against his appointment, as the mayor of Beijing. So, which was a enormous blow, and actually quite astonishing, given that Chen Yun was still a very powerful official in China, even in the late 1980s. Okay, so this kind of resistance led to delayed promotion for Chen Yuan, Liu Yuan, Chen Haosu, Liu Yandong. They all ran into a lot of resistance. In contrast, these always nice people, Lao Haoren, did extremely well in the 1990s. Once they glom onto one of these revolutionary veterans, like Song Ping, like Deng Xiaoping, or even Chen Yun, they took the elevator straight up to extremely high level. In the case of Jiang Zemin, he was in the Xin Sijun, the New Fourth Army faction, and so all the New Fourth Army veterans helped him out. He went from strength to strength, Minister of Electronics, Mayor of Shanghai, Party Secretary of Shanghai, and ultimately in 1989, when it came time to pick the new leader of China, they all said, okay, Jiang Zemin. And the New Fourth Army faction was not the most powerful, but they had a lot of allies. So then Chen Yun, which was not exactly New Fourth Army, he jumped onto the bandwagon. And once the New Fourth Army people, like Wang Daohan, people like that, and Chen Yun backed Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping went along with it. So that's how Jiang Zemin was kind of chosen. So instead of princelings, they picked these Laohaoren, and we know the beneficiaries of this logic. Jiang Zemin, Li Peng. Well, Li Peng's sort of a princeling, quasi-princeling, but definitely Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, He Guoqiang, Wang Zhaoguo. These were all like pretty junior, very inexperienced people who were chosen by the veterans to represent them, to represent their interests, their li, right, for the coming decades. So Jiang Zemin used to bring a lot of gifts to veterans of the Fourth Front Army. So whenever he went to Beijing, he would bring all these gifts, food, clothing. Well, he was, when he became mayor of Shanghai, was based in Shanghai. At that time was still the manufacturing hub for consumer goods. So he could get endless supply of like this tasty treats and so on and so forth. And he channeled that to all the veterans. They all loved him, and he benefited. He became the leader of China as a result. Basically, what this shows is the share of full Central Committee and full and alternate Central Committee members who were princelings, as defined as children of Eighth Party Congress Central Committee members, founding generals like the 开国将领, right? So in 1955, I think the PRC appointed a whole batch of generals who served the revolution very well. So if you're children of that group of generals or vice ministerial level officials by 1956, you were in this group. So as you can see, the height of it was the 17th Party Congress. So the Congress when Xi Jinping was chosen as the next leader of China, that was when the most number of princelings were in the Central Committee. But even that ratio was not very high. I think it's 7% or something. 6%, yeah, close to 7% of the Central Committee. But if you look at both the Central Committee and full members and alternate members, the ratio, of course, is lower. So not to me, that's not an especially high level. Of course, people would say, well, of course, China has like 1.3 billion people. That's an extremely high level. But of course, that's not the baseline. You have to compare the princelings with the best educated people of their cohorts. People who went to Tsinghua, Beida, Renda in the 1960s, and even some of them didn't graduate until the 1970s. For those kind of people, 7%, 6% in the Central Committee, still the princeling had an advantage, but not as high, as much as you would think, right? Princelings were, so this is, so the darker blue line shows the network size, relative size of the princelings compared to the non-princelings, which is the lighter blue line. So you can see that the princelings throughout most of the Congresses until the 19th Party Congress were better networked on average than the non-princelings. And even this result is skewed by the fact that there were a few very densely networked non-princelings who were very close to the princelings, like Zhou Yongkang. So Zhou Yongkang is classified as a non-princeling because he's not a princeling. But of course, he's super networked. He actively promoted his guys from the oil industry and later on Ministry of Public Security and Sichuan into high-level offices. If you were to net out people like Zhou Yongkang, the difference would be even starker, right? So princelings were more connected, and as a result, less desirable for the revolutionary veterans who were promoting people in the 1980s and 1990s. So this led to the result at the 17th Party Congress. So at the 17th Party Congress, so the blue textured bars you can ignore because those were all the people who had to retire by the 18th Party Congress because they were too old. So the blue bars with the texture on it. The red bars were princelings. And interestingly, the most network princeling was Liu Yandong. Well, why couldn't Liu Yandong be the party secretary general of China, of the Chinese Communist Party? Can someone tell me? She is a woman. What's wrong with a woman?
It's the CCP.
Yes, there's nothing wrong with a woman cadre. What's wrong is the Chinese Communist Party, which has never had a woman in the Politburo Standing Committee. This is the problem, right? So Liu Yandong, I would argue, should have been party secretary if you look at the informal network, but she was not chosen because she's a woman. And then other highly network, and then you have Xi Jinping, of course, and ultimately we know what happened there. Oh no, Li Yuanchao. So then next, we'll talk about Li Yuanchao last, actually. I think that's very interesting. And then you have Xi Jinping, and then you have Yu Zhengsheng. Why wasn't Yu Zhengsheng the party secretary general of the Chinese Communist Party? Can someone tell me that? His brother defected to the United States. This is the problem. You can never be the head of the party if your brother defected to the United States. That's a bit of a problem. And then you have Wang Qishan. Wang Qishan was too old already, by 5 years or so. And then Bo Xilai. So actually, this shows that Bo Xilai actually was never a direct threat to Xi Jinping because his network was considerably smaller than that of Xi Jinping. So I don't believe that Bo Xilai was a direct competitor. What Bo Xilai was trying to do with all of his crazy things that he did was to get promoted into the Politburo Standing Committee as the law and politics person, not to be Secretary General. And then you have Li Yuanchao, whose network size, these things are not perfectly measured. So I would say, maybe a little bit higher than Xi Jinping's network, maybe about the same. The problem for him was that he was too clever. So he tried to be both a princeling and a youth league person. And that just doesn't work out. But interestingly, there was a rumor in the 18th Party Congress, I don't know if it's true, that Xi Jinping, basically they're like, okay, we're going to make you Secretary General. Is there anything that you want? He wanted one thing. He's like, I don't want Li Yuanchao to be in the Politburo Standing Committee. This is the reason, because Li Yuanchao was a genuine threat for him. He's not a woman. His brother didn't defect to the United States. His network is sizable. He has some support from the Princeling group and a lot of support from the Youth League. He really was a big threat to Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping did not want him promoted. He didn't get the promotion. And as a result, Xi Jinping was able to totally consolidate power because the only other Princelings who could have challenged his power were a woman and another guy whose brother defected to the United States, which rendered him politically neutral. Okay, so what about today? So these numbers I just ran a couple weeks ago, so they're pretty fresh. So is Xi Jinping pursuing a coalition of the weak? So these bars are a little bit weird. So this is network size. So on the y-axis is a little bit different than what I have in the book. So in the book, I was mainly concerned with people's network with other Central Committee members. Now I have a database which include all the provincial Standing Committee members who are not necessarily in the Central Committee, as well as some of the vice ministers in the especially important organs like 中组部, 中宣部, 统战部, like all the Central Committee organs, the vice ministers. So when you look at the elite, so I do comparison of the 2018 to 2021 period. So it's just right after the 19th Party Congress compared to today. So that's July of 2022. The reason why I do this kind of like very fine-grained comparison is because there was a whole round of provincial party congresses after, well, it actually started in 2021, but it was very intense in the past year, and so there was a lot of provincial level turnovers, which might have changed the size of faction for all these different elite. So what you see, interestingly, is that even Xi Jinping's faction fell a little bit because of aging, right? So a problem with senior officials is that they don't have to retire until they're 70 or whatever. But their followers who are minister or vice ministerial level, they have to retire at a much earlier age. And so there is this inertia which shrink one's faction over time, at least as far as I classify faction, which is using job overlap, right? So all the people who used to work for Xi Jinping in Zhejiang and Fujian, they're getting old and they're retiring. You know, many of them are retiring. So even Xi Jinping's own faction shrank. And the factions who didn't shrink, it must have taken a Herculean effort on their part to replace the retiring faction members with new promotions into the elite pool that I'm looking at. And a few people managed that, including Wang Yang. So Wang Yang's faction is actually larger today than was the case in 2021, interestingly. And I would say Li Xi did a very good job also. It got a little bit smaller, but just tiny bit. And Li Xi, even though he's supposedly very loyal to Xi Jinping, so on and so forth, he actually has a very autonomous faction with very little overlap with Xi Jinping's own faction. It's the largest numerically faction among the elite. So I think there could be some interesting stories with Li Xi in the next 5 years. That's if to the extent that I'm going to make prognosis, that's it could be good, interesting, or bad, interesting. I'm not going to say which one it is. You know, who knows, right? And then you can see that actually Xi Jinping put a lot of effort in shrinking Hu Jintao's faction, and indeed it got a lot smaller. Recently, there was a lot of attention being paid on Li Keqiang's potential challenge to Xi Jinping's authorities. I don't believe that. You know, his faction was not very big to begin with, and it got a lot smaller in the past year, so that it only overlaps with 4.5% of the elite at this point. So I don't think he can really challenge Xi Jinping in any meaningful way. Li Keqiang is a different story. So I think, you know, people like Wang Yang, Wang Yang, Li Xi are still autonomous and pretty influential figures at the very top. And so what happens to Wang Yang and Li Xi and Hu Chunhua? So Hu Chunhua has a decent faction, but mainly among sort of more mid-level officials as opposed to Politburo level people, obviously. But, you know, it's still decent size, you know, at kind of 8% of the elite. So what happens to Hu Chunhua, Wang Yang, and Li Xi, I think, will determine how autonomous the elite is to Xi Jinping's own power in the next 5 years. That's the bottom line of this analysis. So the other bottom line is that there's no coalition of the weak strategy that I can see so far, except for Wang Huning. So Wang Huning, obviously, extremely weak official. He may or may not continue. We'll see who gets into the Politburo and the Politburo Standing Committee at the 20th Party Congress. But I don't think you'll see the kind of massive change that Mao instituted at the 9th Party Congress or the 10th Party Congress. For Xi Jinping, he's still in the zenith of his rule for the next 5 years. And if he is going to pursue coalition of the weak, it will not be until the 21st Party Congress. That would be my guess. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions. Oh, there's a discount code for my book. If you go to the Cambridge University Press website, discount code is SHIH2022. I think all capital letters. It should still work.
Thanks very much. Victor. Have a seat. So we still have plenty of time for questions, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to just ask a few of my own. And I guess I should apologize to you, Victor, for sitting on these chairs. I didn't realize we actually have to specify which chairs we want to sit on for these types of events. So
I'm on the left, so I'm very happy.
right. Okay. Well, I'm probably.
Right?
Yeah. And I'll just sit on my yojuan. Yeah. So in any case, there's a lot of stuff in your presentation, and as well as in and particularly in the book. I mean, I could spend the whole afternoon asking questions, and I imagine we'll have plenty to chat about tonight. And I want to give people here the opportunity as well. So, I guess so. One question just came out at the very end, which is and I'm glad we still have this graph up there. So, on the one hand, we don't. I guess what I'm asking you, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask, by asking that question, as to whether or not that's the right question to ask, or if I'm getting it right. So that, once we're thinking of like, second or third generation Princelings, I mean, does that kind of almost inevitably lead towards kind of a weaker center of gravity? That's the first thing. But kind of, I guess within, even within that, what might just the extensive nature of just the ongoing anti-corruption campaign, might it have some sort of ancillary effect in terms of weakening potential, further generations that, we were thinking about, like, one or two party congresses down the road?
Yeah, so that's thank you. Yeah, so that's a very good question. So after, at first I thought the way that you do, which is that, oh, well, these princelings are going to run out eventually, the blood will thin out, et cetera, et cetera. But the more I look into this, the more I don't think that will happen yet in the near future. And the reason is because there are just so many more princelings than we imagined there to be. Because there were a lot of PLA officers. So I'm just looking at the generals from the 1950s. There were colonels, there were majors. All of these people, they grew up in the barracks, right? PLA barracks, they all knew each other. Some of them, became our colleagues, actually. One of my, anyway, well, over beers, I'll tell you, there's just a lot of people who would identify themselves as Hongse Houdai, right? Like, descendants of the red bloodline, and they are self-producing, right? So maybe not all of them will go back into government or the military. Obviously, a lot of them go into commercial world, but in a large family group, you will have one or two people who go back to the government, and we know that people, in Hu Jintao's family certainly, but in Xi Jinping's own, larger family, they're going back into government to work. And so given that the original pool is very sizable, tens of thousands of mid to senior military party officials in the 1950s, their children, their grandchildren, and then, sort of people they married, I think there's more of these kind of princelings, self-identified princelings to go around for the next sort of 10, 20 years. I would say.
They might not necessarily be
Yeah, they're
dynamism
changing.
of, like, reconfiguring
Right.
and, like,
Yeah.
that's and about the anti-corruption.
Oh, yeah. So, so that certainly has weakened incentives because, the financial return of being a princeling, of being Chinese official has declined. But then you also have to ask the question, it's like in Russia, it's like, what's the alternative? It's like, yeah, all these people, they're making a lot less money than they were before. But, if they came to the US or they go somewhere else, are they really going to make more money? Not necessarily, right? And unless they were to overcome the collective action, overthrow the existing regime, install something new, but even if you were to go through this very risky exercise, you really don't know what your eventual returns will be. So you might as well. So there is this pretty strong status quo bias. So I think, yeah, anti-corruption is bad. So that's why, now the saying is 躺平, right? You just do nothing. You lay down, you don't take a lot of risks, both to help the regime or to sort of hurt the regime. You just don't do very much. But given the number of problems in China today, not doing very much can be bad in the medium term.
Thanks, Victor. I just have two more. One, so the second question I have is there, and maybe this is too precise or me trying to be too clever by half, which wouldn't be the first time, but is there a relationship between you know, degrees of weakness, of these cadres and specific positions that they, would be kind of shepherded into. So, for example, a weak cadre, in charge of the Zhujibu, for example, would that be a different type of person, or would that be a different, than say somebody who would be made like the party secretary of Tianjin, for example?
That's a really good way of thinking about it. I haven't thought about it very much, but I think it's possible. So yeah, there could be some intermediate kind of positions that you can install someone who's fairly networked but not super powerful in. The way that I tend to think more about it is the situation that the dictator finds himself in. So for Mao, if he was quite sure that he could divide and conquer all the different factions prior to the Great Leap Forward, and so he was happy with leaving alone these pretty powerful revolutionary veterans in their different kingdoms, Wangguo, in charge of different parts of the PLA or different parts of the Chinese government. But when he himself suffered a huge political setback in the Great Leap Forward, then he had to pursue this coalition of the weak and very systematically get rid of the powerful, replace them with the weak. So I think the situation, kind of subjective situation that dictators find themselves in is maybe the big, well, at least in my book, is a bigger driving force. But I think that you're right that there's probably this kind of cross-sectional variation also.
I mean, it might be too in the weeds, but I mean, it's potentially intriguing that. So the last one is, it's kind of like it's a kind of more of a kind of cosplay type question, right? So, no, I mean, so one of the conventional wisdom that I tell my students that is now I have to really kind of reconsider, based on your work, is that, for example, the transition from of Jiang Zemin, to kind of, while Deng was still around, to post Deng, was that he essentially played the fool, or whatever you want to call it, up until the fall of 1995. Then Deng falls into his coma, and that's when Jiang demonstrates his real political chops in terms of consolidating. How does your story change that, or how much does that narrative have to adapt now to what you've?
Yeah, so I think, to me, the book addresses one kind of conventional wisdom in Chinese politics, but also in comparative politics. In comparative politics, it's like, oh, one-party dictatorships, they can manage civil military affairs a lot better than, I don't see how it's better than military dictatorships. Like, well, you don't have civil military problems in military dictatorship because military dominates. But anyway, so it's like one-party dictatorships, they do that very well. Even Rod, right, my advisor, his explanation for why China, the Chinese Communist Party, can manage the military so well was that, well, so after the fall of Lin Biao, the military just sort of fell in line. I mean, and to me, that was never such a satisfying explanation without knowing like exactly what was happening. And the Fourth Front Army story, to me at least, I mean, of course, I did 10 years of research, I'm biased, really gave me the key to understanding that. Without this highly compromised faction in the military that multiple generations of leaders made use of, you would not have had such a relatively peaceful relationship between the party and the military, including for Jiang Zemin, right? So one of the final gifts that Deng Xiaoping gave to Jiang Zemin was to appoint both Liu Huaqing, who was in the Fourth Front Army, one of the last people to be in power from the Fourth Front Army, and Zhang Zhen, who was from the First Front Army of Lin Biao and Chairman Mao himself, at the same time as vice chairman of the CMC. And basically by playing those two off of each other, Jiang Zemin, despite the fact that he's a kind of a funny opera singing, actually he's a lot smarter than, he's actually politically quite smart. But he did a lot of silly things, that, okay. he didn't do any silly things. Who am I talking? I mean, we would all sing opera, right? Maybe I'll start singing right here. No, he got the microphone. So, he was able to manage this. In fact, the hardest thing for any dictator to manage, which is his relationship with the military. But he was able to balance those two. I mean, in fact, what happened after Deng Xiaoping died was that Liu Huaqing completely lost control and started this, massive corrupt smuggling ring out of Fujian with his son, the Yuanhua case. And Jiang Zemin was able to rein that in with the help of the other PLA leaders from the First Front Army, finally kind of put Liu Huaqing back in his cage, so to speak. But it was very touch and go for a while, and without these internal factional balancing within the military, it would be extremely hard to manage this.
Thanks. I mean, that's fascinating. There's just that larger point about, the role of the military in this, in this overall explanation. I thought was just, not only just extremely enlightening, but also it was really refreshing to see an analysis that looks at the Chinese military in a serious way. That's not just only about the Chinese military and the coercive apparatus, to really see it as, as a force in politics, not as a relic of the past, but very much, explaining what's happening today, outside of the coercive apparatus. So just fascinating stuff. Run, don't walk to Amazon.com to pick this up. And I'm quite serious. I'm already going to, those of you who are in my Chinese politics class this semester, I'm going to have to update things. But in any case, why don't we open up the floor to questions?
Thank you so much. My name is Z. I'm Professor Murtha's PhD student at China Center. Definitely, I'm really enjoy your talk. And I think the last point about the Yuanhua case is interesting because I have no idea how Xi Jinping survived it, and I blame the Canadian scholar world for not forcing Lai Changxing writing a memorial. And also, I think what you said about the coalition week during the Mao's era is definitely interesting. I think probably the most interesting figure I think is Kang Sheng, how he was the pretty much the Mao's the Mao's purging chief during the 30s, disappeared for 30 years and came back in the 60s. Definitely interesting. Since I can only ask one question, I think the question I want to ask you is, so you have this coalition of the weak thesis in the 1980s, and I think it makes perfect sense. What happened after Jiang Zemin? Because from the 90s, from the 2000s, the theory we heard the most was Cheng Li's, the Princelings, the Shanghai Gang versus the Youth League Tuanpai theory. And this is also a time that the beneficiaries of the previous coalition of the weak, the technocrats didn't really get anywhere. Like, for example, I've always baffled at how the people from the finance governance, like Guo Shuqing, like Lou Jiwei, they've been doing their years for essentially like almost 30 years. And then Guo Shuqing went to Shandong but never emerged or anything. And Zhou Xiaokang was a PBOC president for how much? 15 years? And I'm not even sure that's even legal in the party charter, because I think the rule is one person could be only in the same position for 10 years, but he served 15. So what happened? So I just really want to ask what was happening during this era, pretty much. Thank you.
Thanks. So whether there's coalition of the week happening, definitely the numbers that I have suggest in the Hu Jintao period, that did not happen. And the reason is because Hu Jintao actually systematically promoted the most networked of his followers, like Hu Chunhua, Li Keqiang, and so on and so forth, because he knew that he would have to retire after 10 years. And he wanted to have as much post-retirement influence as possible by promoting the most capable politicians. Xi Jinping is not doing that. But he's not pursuing a full-blown coalition of the weak either, as you can see. But basically, a lot of these people like Li Qiang and Huang Kunming and people like that, they're pretty weak on their own because they share their networks with Xi Jinping himself. So they don't really have a lot of their own followers. So they're relatively weak, but not completely weak. Not like Wang Huning. If everyone became like Wang Huning, then that's would be quite interesting. But definitely, you do see a difference between Hu Jintao's strategy and Xi Jinping's strategy. Jiang Zemin was the late. Basically, most of Jiang Zemin era overlapped with Deng Xiaoping. 1990. So, it's hard to say. I mean, and of course, he made use of the Fourth Front Army also through Liu Huaqing. Exactly. Right. Exactly. So lying flat, you see this a lot in the civilian world, so in local government. But I do have to say, every time I think that, because I look at the budget also, I mean, local governments are running out of money. They just don't have money. Civil servants are not being paid. But pandemic control is still happening. Zero COVID. You see this even in small cities, the 大白, right? People wearing big white suits, they're out in force, they're enforcing zero COVID. And to me, it's quite astonishing. Why don't you see this kind of late Qing phenomenon where it's like, wow, 摆烂, right? You just, whatever, everything's messed up. I just won't do my job. I just, whatever, let it just, rot away. That is not happening when it comes to pandemic control. When it comes to other social policies, it totally is happening. Like a lot of public goods are being under-delivered. The whole real estate sector is stalled. But pandemic control, because I think it's, the Communist Party, despite a lot of challenges, they can still tell the entire cadre body that you have to do this one thing for me. And if they really focus and narrow it down to one or two things, the party will still do it. And right now, it's pandemic control. They're not successful in doing a lot of other things before pandemic control. In the military, it's kind of a strange story. So military is kind of hard to say because they're still getting increases in budget. It's like one of the very few departments in the Chinese government, except, I would say in addition to China Cyberspace Administration and of course security, the PLA is still getting increases in budget. So they're still positively incentivized to do whatever Xi Jinping wants them to do. But I think the budget constraint may become tighter in the next few years so that even military budgets get cut. I mean, I think that would be kind of interesting.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Professor Shih, for this. It's totally fascinating. I'm Gloria. I'm actually a student at Cornell, but I took Andy's China seminar 5 years ago, I think. Yes. So my question is more like a clarifying one. I'm just wondering, so when a leader pursue this this coalition of the weak strategy, is it more because this is a personal political decision, or is there any structural condition that allow certain leader to pursue this strategy in an easier way, or can we just use their personality or their experience to explain such strategic move?
Yeah. Oh, wow. You're starting to sound like journal reviewers, which I love. So this is like a scope condition question. Oh my God, I just got a review. It's like, clarify your scope conditions, please. It's like, this is wonderful. Yeah, exactly. So the scope condition for this theoretical framework, and I don't have a formal model. I mean, I have a choice theoretical model, not a game theoretical model. But the scope condition is, so that you do have to have some institutionalization in the party, such that the elite is limited in size. If you can endlessly just kind of expand the higher elite, then this doesn't really work. And then the other scope condition is that the external environment has to be relatively stable, right? So if you have very hard external challenges, you can't really appoint a bunch of weak people because they wouldn't be able to do their jobs, and the regime is going to fall, right? So I do think that a relatively stable external environment is a precondition. So in the conclusion of the book, I do say that basically, I think the best thing for Xi Jinping to pursue, if he wanted to be dictator for life, is to copy what Mao did, because what Mao did works. It allowed Mao to be dictator for life, and he was very sick. He barely knew what was going on in the world, and no one dared to challenge his power. Right? His nephew was, his spokesperson, because he pursued the coalition of the weak. But of course, he did it in a world where the U.S. no longer was a threat to China, and the Soviet, because of this kind of the Soviet had their own internal problems at the time, but also because of China's new kind of alliance with the United States, did not also want to encroach on China. And that created a very good environment for Mao to pursue coalition of the weak. And so if Xi Jinping wants to pursue very ambitious foreign policy agenda, then maybe there is a trade-off that he can't pursue coalition of the weak, which internally will be somewhat costly to him. I mean, exactly how costly is kind of hard to say.
Thank you, Professor. And my name is Shih, and I'm the fresh year student here. And I love MC Power very much, but whatever, I've been there. My question is very short, but a little bit digression, because you mentioned in the opening that you appreciate Jiang Qing very much. And I wonder, could you please explain me why? Thanks so much.
Jiang Qing. Are we ready for this rabbit hole here? Comrade Jiang Qing. Well, okay, so first of all, I think a lot of bad things that people say about Jiang Qing is either outright fabrication or just people didn't understand the situation in which she found herself back during the Cultural Revolution. Most of what she did was at the behest of Chairman Mao. So she was, obviously as a member of the coalition of the weak, she didn't have her own power base. All of her authorities came from Chairman Mao. And so most of the people that she went after were because Chairman Mao wanted her to go after these people. There were some exceptions. So there were these writers whom she knew back in the 1930s who had this compromising material on her. And so she really went after those people and, killing some of them and putting them in jail, etc. But again, that stemmed from this deep fear of, people exposing her past mistakes, and then herself falling from power. That's something that anyone would have done, right? So, just because she's a woman, it's like, oh my God, she's a white bone demon and all this kind of stuff. But it's like any rational actor would have done exactly what she did. On the positive side, she promoted a lot of women cadres to senior level. So, in the education ministry, so this tradition of having a woman in charge of education, healthcare, that started with Jiang Qing. Actually, Jiang Qing was the one who promoted women cadres to the vice ministerial and ministerial level. And if it weren't for her, we wouldn't even have this pitiful tradition of having women be ministers in education and health. I mean, of course, it should be much more than that. And actually, Jiang Qing was on course to build even more women being promoted at the provincial level in central ministries. I mean, she did it for self-interest, right? So she wanted more people in her own faction to be in powerful positions, but it did serve the interests of women's right in the Chinese Communist Party. So, I mean, as a result, I think she's one of the greatest officials in the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just...
You're digesting.
Thank you. My name's Fei, and I'm first-year student. I'd just like to throw in a little bit of current events here, because next month is going to be the 20th Party Congress. So we know there's this little informal rule in Chinese when they have the Party Congress or when they select PSC members. It's called 7 up, 8 down, right?
Yeah.
And then you just mentioned how, basically Xi's faction got a little bit smaller, and then there's anticipation, of course, people like Liu He, who's his... he's going to retire, and of course, his political ally. So I'm just asking, does she have the motivation or even the audacity to change that status quo, which is sort of an ad hoc thing in the first place when it was established by Jiang Zemin? So, yeah.
Yeah, so very good question. So I've been giving this presentation like 50 times this summer. But the bottom line of my analysis actually is the opposite of what you think. So if he adjusts 七上八下 downward to 六上七下, that actually is more advantageous to him at the Politburo Standing Committee level, because then Li Keqiang, Wang Yang, but also Wang Huning, they all have to retire. But Li Keqiang and Wang Yang are the two independent, and in the case of Wang Yang, still quite powerful, as you can see, politician at the PSC level. Xi Jinping can push them aside and then replace them with people who are very dependent on him, like Li Qiang, Huang Kunming, and Chen Minar. So all three of those are less than 67 years old, so they can become Politburo Standing Committee member. The person who gets sacrificed is Tai Chi, right? So Tai Chi is exactly 67 also. If he shifts it to 66 up, 67 down, then Tai Chi doesn't have a chance. But I think it's okay because, you know, Xi Jinping's got quite a number of people in the Politburo. Most of them will still get, will be qualified to get into Politburo Standing Committee member under a 66 up, 67 down rule.
So we have time for one more question. That gentleman's hand went up.
Well, her hand's been up for a long time. Oh yeah.
Let's do a speed. Let's do a kind of speed round.
Yeah, let's take both. Yeah. Yeah, of course.
Thanks. Thanks for your really wonderful speech. And I found the research methods you used and the data you collect is really appealing. I have one question regarding to the previous slide that you mentioned. You collected and measured the connection network of all the Politburo members. I'm just wondering what are the aspects are you looking for? For example, like their work experiences with previous veterans, or their family connections, or the other things.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. My name is Wei Yan. I'm a second year MA student here. Yeah, focused on China.
Right,
Thank
right.
you.
Hi, Professor Shih. Thanks for your detailed and vivid introduction of your new book entitled Second Year MIR Student Size. I found the argument in your book is quite interesting, since the incoherent incentives to use the strategy of the weak to consolidate the power at the top. But I'm wondering that because back to the 1960s in China, the Chairman Mao used because he had at that time made lots of mistakes due to his extreme approach or the far leftist approach. So in my view, I think the reason why he used or picked some inexperienced cadres was to keep his face and use it to link himself to the masses or the people so that he could consolidate his power. So I'm wondering what's the relationship between the weak strategy, the consolidation of top leaders' power, and the mobilization of the masses or 群众. Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so on the question of what's the basis of factional affiliation that I measure, these are mainly job overlap, right? So if we have a Politburo member, you know, let's say Li Xi, who was Qinghai party secretary, I believe, someone who's Tingji Ganbu or Chuji Ganbu in Qinghai would be identified as being in his faction automatically, right? So there's of course measurement errors and stuff like that, but there's a large literature showing that if you measure it that way, it does a pretty good job in predicting like promotions and stuff like that. Okay, so on the Cultural Revolution question, I have always been very dissatisfied with the explanation of the Cultural Revolution. It's like, oh, you know, Chairman Mao wanted to radicalize the youth, you know, so that they can be revolutionary successors and so on and so forth. What happened to those people in the end? Right? What happened to the Red Guards? What happened to all these people? The senior ranks of the Red Guards, many of them went to jail. Wu Yao Liu, 分子, right? So the May 16th cadres, they were all purged. Wang Li, a lot of the radicals who helped Mao, and in fact I have a whole chapter on this, who helped Mao with galvanizing the Cultural Revolution from the grassroots, they were jailed. The masses of the Red Guards were 下放, were sent to the countryside. Many of them never to return, actually. They just became farmers or like, country teachers and so on and so forth. 就牺牲了, right? So basically just sacrificed. If Mao had wanted to cultivate them to be revolutionary successors, why was there not an orderly system to induct the activists among the Red Guards into different parts of the Chinese government? So there was some attempt in Shanghai. So Shanghai was the only place that systematically introduced some of these Red Guards into the Shanghai municipal government, and many of them became fabulously corrupt in the 1980s, of course. But they were introduced. But Shanghai, I would say, was the exception. Everywhere else, by the time you had these revolutionary committees being in charge of local governments, oftentimes it was not the Red Guards, but the workers' representatives who represented the masses. And the Red Guards did not fare very well, except for Shanghai again, right? So I don't really buy that the whole Cultural Revolution was about cultivating, these zealots to take over ideologically, because with the exception of the Gang of Four itself, very few of the early Red Guards actually benefited from Chairman Mao's policies.
And on that cynical note, we'll conclude today's program. Victor, thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.